Hey guys, and welcome back. It's Cabezon here, and we're going to talk about Halo's story. Ever since 343 took over, it's been a little bit whack and all over the place. Halo 4 was polarizing, Halo 5 obviously much more so. And Infinite, while I really did enjoy it, I don't think it took off nearly as much as 343 would have liked. But I don't think that means Halo is cooked. Rather, I wholeheartedly believe that if 343 can restructure how we look at Halo 4, 5, and Infinite, as well as the OG trilogy, we can tie Halo's entire story into one final, satisfying narrative arc with a solid concluding ending, obviously, for Halo and frankly the Chief. Allow me to show you how. Now, first, I feel like it is important to discuss why the OG trilogy did so well and why I think 343 has struggled, and it all has to do with narrative structure. Now, when we talk about narrative structure, there's a very common element to like every movie, screenplay, book, what have you, and that is the 3-act structure. It's pretty simple. Act 1 is the setup, Act 2 is your confrontation, and Act 3 is the resolution. Each act features significant plot points. These usually act as an inflection point to let you know that when you've transitioned from one act into the next. Act 1 is all about realizing you have no choice but for the hero to face the antagonist. Act 2 is where you build up your team, but there's going to be a midpoint, a reversal, some sort of loss, setback that leaves the protagonist at a low point. But obviously, as all good stories will have, in that transition to Act 3, they get back on their feet, they rally, and they see a last climatic battle where obviously they win it all in defeating their enemy. Now, taking that structure, let's think about it from the perspective of Halo CE, obviously a classic and a self-contained story. It opens cold with a Pillar of Autumn on the run. Real quick exposition. We don't have to have a whole bunch dumped on us. We can quickly infer what's happening. You have the humanity, which is clearly a sci-fi, advanced race, but they're on the run from aliens that clearly outsmart them, or at least have better technology. Cortana mentions as much, like they got there faster. They always were going to. As an audience member, you immediately know, like, hey, these bad guys are a threat and they're more capable and advanced. And then when they talk about waking the Chief up, we see everyone's reactions, their body language in the game, even though, Xbox OG graphics, but you're like, hey, this dude's gotta be a badass, because everyone's like, whoa. And so with saying minimal words, the cutscene's only like a few minutes long, you quickly have an idea of everything that's happening, that humanity is going up to arms to defend themselves, and we're committed. That is your inciting event. They see the Halo ring, that's the next big one up, and after being boarded, they realize they have no choice but to land on it. That is your first plot point, a point of no return typically. Once they crash on the ring, the Unician humanity has nowhere to go. They must fight the Covenant, even if it's the last man. They don't have a choice. And so that's where we enter Act 2. Now, this is all about confrontation. But if you think about it, it's not really the Covenant we're confronting, is it? We'll get into that in a second. We go straight into the rising action. If you think about it, we're rescuing Marines, we're establishing resistance, we rescue Keys and others from the Truth of Reconciliation, we're building a plan. Obviously, there's some setbacks there, but for the most part, we're feeling confident, we're reaching our goals, and we're going to take the fight to the Covenant. But there's a hang-up. After we find the control room, we realize something's terribly wrong. That midpoint, that reversal, is the unleashing of the Flood, their reveal. It's a startling and sudden thing that happens, right? As a kid, it was terrifying. And what went from being a weapon they could use to their advantage against the Covenant is now this awful entity that's consuming all of them. Captain Keyes is missing, as is Johnson, both presumably dead. Chief is separated from the Unicy and Cortana, ending with him in the library with 343. But from midpoint to plot point 2, that's when you start to hey, we're going to learn something, undergo some characterization. Not really for the Chief, but if you think of it from the UNSC, it's them understanding that it's no longer about defeating the Covenant, but there's a much larger and ancient battle still raging. You have Master Chief teaming up with 343 to fire the ring and destroy the Flood, but there's a hang up there, right? Well, obviously, the pre-climax, plot point 2, that's a low point in the story, and that's when the Chief as a character is caught off guard. When Cortana reveals that the ring actually kills all of them, that's probably not a good thing. 343 turns on them, and now Chief is alone with Cortana, no easy answers. And so that takes us to the climatic battle. They go out of the way to disable the phase pulse generators, delaying 343 from any means of activating the rings. They grab Key's neural net, they head to the Pillar Autumn, they have a plan. Just them two, but they're going to blow the ship up, and they're going to destroy the ring, even if it means everyone else on it, which is ultimately what happens. You have this decisive battle that features both the Covenant, Sentinels in 343, the Flood, and the Chief comes out on top. That right there is a good 3-act structure, but more so than just Halo CE, it applies across all games. If you think about it, the OG trilogy roughly follows that format. Halo C is the setup. We're introduced to the Flood, Covenant humanity. We understand relatively their power levels and what are the risks associated with them. We have our exposition, the inciting event, the release of the Flood, and the potential firing of the rings. Halo 2 is your confrontation. Earth has been discovered. No choice now but to fight. We kill Regret, but the Chief is isolated. It ends on a cliffhanger where they almost fired the ring, and now it's at the Ark. So even though you have some victories, it's a low point. Earth is being occupied by the Covenant. Humanity's forces are scattered. We know the Covenant knows where the Ark is, and they're going to get there and light the rings unless we do something. And that's where Halo 3 obviously ties it up as a resolution. We'll rejoin the conflict. We take the fight to the Covenant. We get to the Ark. Obviously, you have the Great Schism in Halo 2 that acts as kind of a midpoint, so now that affects what happens in 3. And you have this last Herculean effort to stop truth. But there's consequences that comes with the rising stakes of a 3-act story. You have to have an increase in action before you have a release post-climax, so to speak. In this case, Miranda is killed, as is Johnson. We kill Truth and 343, but the Flood is spread all over the Ark. We have no choice but to fire the in-progress ring, destroying much of the Ark and potential like humans and Covenant, as well as allied Sanhelion and their forces in the area. So again, you have a resolution. The rings are no longer a significant threat. The Covenant has been splintered. The prophets are dead, but there's consequences. Chief has been lost to space. Humanity is battered, alive, but almost barely. That trilogy followed a very logical 3-act setup, and that's why I think it felt so good. You have continued increasing in tension, like I said, and then a climax where everything settles and there's conclusions. But the problem is we just simply don't see that in the Reclaimer saga. I'm talking about 4, 5, and Infinite here. I mean, sure, the individual games do their best to follow a 3-act structure, but just not very well. I mean, think about it. When we open up in Halo 4, compare that to opening to Halo CE. Chief wakes up to Cortana, who's been gifted enhanced physical features, if you will, and it's like, hey, the Covenant are back. I'm pretty sure Chief even remarks, and he's like, why? And I still can't tell you a good reason. I understand, obviously, Jul and Dama and the whole thing, but there was no teasers or trailers in the lead up to 4. There was nothing that really established that there was multiple factions. I mean, clearly it's more than logical to assume that a religious entity as a Covenant splintering would have factions vying for power in the vacuum that was left. But still, that is introduced to us not in a meaningful way. Even more so, we're at Requiem and we fall into the Shield planet and our adversary is going to be the Didact. But if you think about it, that opening hook, the introduction to Halo 4, you don't even find out who the Didact is until later in the campaign. So we're not doing in my opinion, a great job of establishing what's the actual context of the conflict here. Obviously, even worse is the fact that if you go from Halo 4 to Halo 5, I mean, nothing in Halo 4 really matters for what happens in Halo 5, nor does anything that happens in Halo 5 really matter for Halo Infinite. I mean, we defeat the Didact in Halo 4, and then he's apparently not dead, and he dies in a comic. Halo 5 has Cortana back after her tragic sacrifice in Halo 4, and now she's a bad guy, talking about the Domain and the Created, something that was never talked about in 4. I don't think the Domain ever came up either. I mean, that was mentioned in the books, but still, really poor job of setting the table for further games. And then once we get to Infinite, we're fighting the Banished, who have not been featured at all in 4 and 5. Cortana is dead and happens off screen, and I understand why 343 did that, but if you think about it in a 3-act way, it just fails on each single level. There's no resolution, I mean, without happening off screen. So how can 343 possibly fix this? Because it certainly feels like a low point, right? We've lost 343's leadership, which is frankly probably for the better, but the campaign team has been gutted. There's no multiplayer narrative now, so we're not really getting any new information, but is it still possible to save the story? And I think the answer is yes. Halo Infinite has been doing really well with Season 5, but for a campaign fan like myself, and probably you if you're watching this video, it is a lot of uncertainty. But allow me to explain why I think it is possible for 343 to take Halo 4, 5, and Infinite Story, as well as the OG Trilogy, and without any major retcons, or even light retcons, just simple, straightforward kind of restructuring and how they tell it, could be able to build it into a single coherent story that has a satisfying conclusion. I think at this point, we have to accept that it is time to end Halo's story. We cannot simply pump Chief out against a new adversary every, at this point, 7 years, unless we want to end up like WoW. I'm a big WoW guy, but man, they really be busting out the Time++ enemies. Like, we have the Xanilin now with almost nothing featured on them. Do we really want to continue playing Halo games where that's true? Or would we rather finally see a solid concluding arc to Chief? I mean, Halo games can continue, but we get some closure, some resolution. So let's quickly talk about what open threads threads 343 has left out there? What if we want to tie it all together, who are the people we should talk to and about? Well, I think number one on that list is going to be Mendicant Bias. I know your eyes are probably rolling because you heard about him a million times. I mean, yeah, shit, if you're a fan of Hidden Xperia like I am, you've probably heard all the theories. But it's true. A character that's been hinted at back to Halo 2, he was in the shadows and the terminals in Halo 3, he featured heavily in the Forerunner trilogy. The fact that he has not shown up in the games is kind of disappointing. That's a major character that should have made an appearance. Another one that's similar is the Didact. I don't think you write a trilogy of books with Greg Bear and you take such an important and tragic, frankly, character, defeat him in Halo 4 and then throw him out. I think that the whole him getting composed in the comic art maybe should be retconned just slightly. In some form or shape, I think the Didact should be back, at least to have a role and some closure for his character. I'll explain why that can actually work and be satisfying. On top of that, obviously we're missing the Arbiter. I mean, the dude's ahead of an ally faction. It's simple. Not much to say there. He needs to come back. But we also need to ramp up what's happening with the Banished. We introduced him in Halo Wars 2, the conflict at the Ark with the Spirit of Fire. They show up at Zeta Halo. Atriox is, well, he's somewhere at some point in time. We don't really know. But that needs a conclusion too. We need to figure out what's happening with the Created. We know Cortana's dead, but I mean, I'm cool with 343 kind of hand-waving it a bit because I thought the Created story arc was lame, but still, it needs to be tied up. And last but not least, obviously, we have all of the issues with the Xanilin. Everything that's been hinted there with the Endless and whatnot. We need to find a way to wrap that up too. And it doesn't help that it was introduced so late in Halo's story and there's so much open about it. But that's the thing though. Each of these factions has something in common. I think that there's actually an overarching conflict in Halo across the entire timeline. I'm talking about Precursors to Forerunners to now in the timeline in Halo Infinite. It is a conflict over the mantle responsibility. Each of those previous characters and factions in some shape or form has tried to compete for it in some ways. Obviously the Arbiter and the Banished no, but the Created has, the Didact has, Mendicant, the Forerunners, Precursors, and the Xanilin have not, but I think it would be worthwhile for them to join it. And so as a quick recap, I don't want to belabor it, but if you're new to kind of like the expanded lore, long time ago we had the Precursors, more or less like God, but not like a nice God. In my opinion, I see them as this species that feels no pain, no time. They exist at all points. And so they don't experience loss or emotion like we do because they've existed for eons. They're almost like a cold scientist. They are a tier 0 species that enables the creation and evolution of others, including humanity and Forerunners. But obviously, because they're kind of cold, when they have a species they feel like isn't working, they just prune them away. And that was their goal with the Forerunners. They felt like the Forerunners were not suitable to inherit the mantle, and so they were going to kill all of them, much like a scientist would throw out a bad experiment. The problem is the Forerunners were a sentient species, and clearly they didn't like that answer. I mean, would you, if you got told by your version of God, he was like, actually, you guys suck, I'm going to kill all of you? A good chunk of people would be like, hell no, brother, we about to throw hands. And they did, and the Precursors all died for it. With all their foresight and wisdom, they were unable to prevent their own demise, which could be an argument that the Precursors were also not worthy of the mantle, because their demise, the Forerunners taking over, has set the stage for the galaxy to consume itself in conflict and the flood ever since. So now you have the Forerunners in charge. You have humanity there, it's unchecked, and you get the conflict between the two. That's like the big, true, inciting incident. Because if you think about it, humanity only started the conflict because they were running from the flood. The flood, in my opinion, I don't think they're controlled or they are a precursor. The way I like to think about it is that the flood are like the lasting echoes or impressions of the precursor's wrath. If you could think about like a precursor screaming into the void in anger and hate, but you know, this dude is a multi-dimensional being, and that anger gets interwoven into space-time itself. And so you have the flood that are almost like a central sentience, but they're all just like fingers, the hands of a greater being, and the greater being isn't really a conscious one. It's just hate and anger. The creator trying to kill his creations after what they did to them. And so humanity fights the Forerunners trying to run from the flood. And the Forerunners kill all of them because they're like, well, not all of them, but they subjugate them and devolve them. And in their opinion, they're like, we are entitled to the mantle and humanity is not. Humanity pruning away 400 worlds with flood would be the envisioning of the mantle as the precursors saw it. But the Forerunners were too proud. They're like, we can do better, and we're not going to ask humanity for help and understand how they did it. And of course, they lost their war. But as a segue, this is what I said, that I think the Didact is a tragic character. And a tragic in a Greek tragedy sense. I mean, hear me out. if you think about it right, the Didact is the main warrior of the Forerunners. He's responsible for winning, the war against humanity, subjugating them. He leads their armies. He's of high rank and esteem in Forerunner society. That is typically a staple in a Greek tragedy. You have to have a lot of renown before you can fall, and that's usually due to flaws. And the Didact was deeply, deeply flawed. He was stubborn and proud. He punished humanity instead of reasoning with them. He felt like none other than the Forerunners should have the mantle, and that hubris led to him and the Forerunners confronting the flood alone. And obviously, they lost. And he spent 100,000 years sitting in his cryptum, cut off from the domain, suffering for it. A tragic end. And obviously, we beat him in Halo 4, and now he's all messed up, partially composed, barely recognizable, suffering endlessly, until 343, kills him and brings him back. But still, it's a tragic end, in very much the Greek tragic sense. Bringing it back to Halo Infinite and where the current story is right now, if you think about it, when we talk about that conflict for the mantle, Foreigners clearly lost. Maybe the Precursors right. They weren't worthy. They got their asses kicked. The Covenant never really sought to take up the mantle, but they did want to dictate to everyone else how to live their lives through their religious vision. They too got their ass kicked. The Created tried to take up the mantle through Force under Cortana's leadership, and well, Cortana's dead. She blew herself up. So presumably, they also are getting or have gotten their ass kicked. The only one who has not failed in their duty in the mantle is the Chief, and by extension the UNSC, but really just low-key the Chief. My man's be putting the team on his back, and he has saved their asses more times than you can count. Clearly, he's the protagonist of a video game series, so that's by design. But I know Bungie was really big into using Christianity and the Abrahamic religions as inspiration. It is not lost on me that the Chief is a good, kind of like prodigal son, the savior of humanity. And so now here we have the stage set. We understand that the ultimate conflict in my proposed storyline here is the mantle. We've seen failures. So how do we get there from Infinite, and why do we make 4 and 5 matter? Well, it gets a little bit murky, and maybe take some retcons. But I firmly believe that by bringing the Flood back, establishing them as the final concluding enemy for one reason, and one reason only, because they're the lasting punishment from the Precursors. Like I said, they are a lasting, final, to whom it concerns bullet fired by the Precursors. Punishment against their creations for the sins of the Forerunners. And so by defeating them somehow, that's how you truly show that humanity is worthy of the mantle. But I don't think you can defeat them like we defeated them in Halo 3, where they're just like, oh no, the Flood are gone. I mean, do you really think something like the Flood was only at Void and somehow was perfectly cleansed and via the High Charity only on the Ark? What I propose is instead that the Flood is still out there. We've seen with Season 5 and Halo Infinite the introduction of Spartan 4s that are infected with the Flood. Hear this. Imagine you have a cold open to a game, the next game, Halo Infinite 2, and you're a Spartan 4 team. You have some quick exposition on the status of the universe and the UNSC. We know Chief and the Zeta Halo is completely missing because they got teleported off somewhere crazy. We understand that the Created have lost their orders and they more or less have disappeared. I'm cool with that. Just make them go away. And so now we have these Spartans that are hunting down Flood remnants. And let's say something goes wrong and they get infected, and you're like on a ship that was calling Mayday, and it's just absolutely, crazy horror. If you think about it, no Spartan has fought the Flood, to my knowledge, besides the Chief. Because in Halo C, it was just him. 2, it was just him. And 3, for the most part, it was just him. I understand that there's been some episodes here in the Expanded Universe as well as Halo Wars, but for the most part, very, very rare opportunities. And so now you have Spartans that are infected with the Flood, and imagine how crazy that would be. I'm talking about fighting them as an adversary, like super twitchy. Like if you ever played Dead Space, like the soldiers at the end of the game, like twitching out crazy fast. Imagine that, but Spartan 4s. Shielded, accurate, deadly, horrifying, and very, very fast. I mean, it would be a pretty cool mini boss. But that's the cold open. You have a Spartan team, pure horror, they get killed, the Flood consumes them. Now everyone knows, okay, the conflict here, the Flood's back. We can introduce some of the stuff about the mantle later, but we get everyone's minds in the right place. Obviously, there's still a lot of open threads here with the Xanilin and whatnot, but I think you go from that opening straight to the Chief. We can get to the Xanilin here in a second. I would say, like, maybe while he's fighting the Banished, word gets back from the Ark somehow. We know there's Banished there, we know the Spirit of Fire is there. It just, however it happens. And honestly, if you have a better idea, leave it in the comments. But the central part here is that this new conflict reaches them, and the Banished and humanity decide to make a temporary truce in order to fight this battle. Once the Flood is starting to spread, they both realize, like, hey, we cannot simply fight each other here over Zeta Halo, where things ultimately are meaningless because we're out in the middle of nowhere. We need to find a way back. A momentary truce, close, right? Aatrox and Sheaf will get their moment where they fight each other to the death. They don't need to be poised. They're not dapping each other up like the Arbiter. I think it should just be like, hey, we know what we have to do now. So you bring them back into the main universe, ideally through the arc, so that you can introduce the Spirit of Fire. Because obviously the Spirit of Fire is cool. We get to meet Cam Cutter in person in the games, as well as Red Team, introduce some more Spartans. It's fun, right? A little bit of fan service, but hey, if this is going to be the last game, let's do it right. I think this could be a moment too to try and wrap up, or at least introduce some more thoughts about the Xanilin. I personally think they should be descendants of the Precursors, but not as part of any central consciousness or anything like that, but instead more like biological cousins. Like maybe a Precursors that evolved themselves and eventually re-evolved into the Xanilin. And so you have this conflict here where the Xanilin feel like maybe they discover something on Zeta Halo after they've been released, where they feel like, hey, they are actually related to Precursors, maybe through some sort of exploration on Zeta Halo, they take it upon themselves that they are the ones worthy of the mantle because they are the true descendants. And so now, again, you're introducing the idea of the conflict over the mantle to the Xanilin. And so they will be a follow-up threat. Maybe you fight them a little bit on Zeta Halo, or maybe we just fight them later on. So now we find ourselves in, transitioning into that second act, right? The first act, the inciting event, is cool. There's a flood outbreak, and this time it's flood-infected Spartans. Shit's gone tits up, it's getting pretty bad. So now we're getting the boys back together. Like I said, banished humanity, they're not working together. They're simply maybe deciding to stand up their own armies to face a different threat together. Not side by side, but more like you're not going to kill a banished dude unless it's just like a really good shot. Act 2, like I mentioned, is all about raising an army, the rising action. So this is when Chief's like, hey, if the Flood are truly back and shit is out of control, it's time to start gathering some allies. Obviously, offensive bias was hinted at heavily in Halo Infinite, so maybe we get an introduction to him, but I think there should be a twist on it. I think that offensive bias should be too rigid. He believes at this point the only way is to go to the Ark and light the rings, and maybe he's completely obsessed with doing so, much like 343 was. I don't think he should be 343 2.0, but I feel like it's logical for him, and maybe in this process, we run into Mendicant, a twist, a midpoint in the story, and we realize that Mendicant is actually more on our side than offensive bias is. Mendicant making the case that offensive is always inferior because he lacked true free will. The free will that allowed Mendicant to fail is what made him so potent, and his failure has made him resolute to atone for his sins. It'd be a good opportunity to toss in a flashback to Halo 3, remind players a little bit about Mendicant, and then God knows if they want to jump on YouTube, they'll find more than enough information. But we get Mendicant in the fight, and maybe Mendicant is the one that's like, hey, the Didact fought the Flood, and he lost, but there's still some lessons to be learned there. And it's like, cool, he was partially composed, but you know where you could find him then if he was composed into the domain? Well, maybe on Malthrillian. And so Chief, Esparza, Cortana 2.0, hopefully going by a cooler name like Joyous or Durandal, and the boys are going to head to Malthrillian, but they still got to find it, right? So you introduce a little bit of conflict there of them maybe trying to find like whatever it's called, a key, something that lets you see all Forerunner structures, but you lead them to Malthrillian, and that's where they're going to try and link up with the Didact. You need a little bit of a MacGuffin, right? Like some sort of tool, driving element in the story. Chekhov's gun sometimes is another literary thing, a trope that you hear, some sort of introduction that has to play a role later. Maybe the Mendicant knows of something in his interactions with the Primordial on Zeta Halo that he believes may allow them to cut off the central consciousness that allows the Flood to be so deadly. Because without that, without like that Gravemind presence, they would simply be rabid animals. You get to Malthrillian and there's Abaddon, a quasi-precursor AI that's been around since forever. Now this here is a good opportunity to maybe have setbacks, but it's also an opportunity to introduce some more precursor exposition. I think precursors should be left vague, don't get me wrong. We don't need to do the Forerunner treatment where we take them from the background where they're mystery and make them a very non-mystery, but give the players, especially those that don't read the books, a bit of an opportunity to understand the stakes here. You have to establish that the Flood's reemergence is punishment, continuation of the Precursor's wrath, and also incredibly dangerous. I'm talking about like maybe having Earth being consumed by the Flood. I know that sounds crazy, but for there to be stakes and true tension, you have to show the player what's at risk. And so maybe, they defeat Abaddon, they get into the domain in some shape, and they're able to pull the Didact out. And so now you have the person that was responsible for subjugating humanity, realizing that Forerunners are dead forever. They're gone. His species is done. The dude's pretty much like baked toast at this point. But he can make a sacrifice on the part of humanity to right the sins, right his own wrongs. And this is also, in my opinion, a good opportunity to have the Xanilin show up maybe as a fleet and there's a conclusive battle and they all die. Because like I said, the Xanilin are a weak antagonist because we don't know anything about them. It could be an opportunity, maybe Aatrox goes down fighting them. He's not, an ally of humanity, but he understands what's at stake and he chooses to go down fighting like a warrior, adding some depth to a complex character. We tend to see him as evil because that's how we feel playing against him in Halo Wars 2 and in Infinite. But Aatrox isn't really evil. He's kind of like a mafia boss, man. He takes care of his people. But he realizes that there's more at stake there, more than just the neighborhood. And I like that. I think there's depth to that. And now let's move into Act 3, the resolution, right? We got to take 4, 5, Infinite, like I said, we got to bring this all together. We're trying right now, but we still got some work to do. So maybe this is where you have to have some payoffs and some tragic endings. I'm talking about deaths of people on the good guy team, something that has to unravel their plans a little bit. You got to knock people down before they get back up. I think it would be a good opportunity. Maybe Mendicant takes control of some ships and he's fighting off a flood fleet. He's about to get overwhelmed and he blows himself up. And it's his way of making atonement for the fact that he failed the Forerunners, and this time he's not failing. He's giving Chief a chance. In the same way, like I said, the Didact, a tragic character that fell from grace, is able to make a do, fighting the flood maybe hand to hand, because he's a warrior, and he ends up going down fighting, but all to buy Chief time. Again, sacrificing the ultimate sacrifice to make up for the sins that he had committed previously. The Arbiter, someone who's always been loyal, goes down fighting with Chief side to side, understanding that's a one-way trip. Now, where should this grand battle take place? I'm really big in the idea that things should be cyclical. I think if you found the Primordial and Charum Hakor, the ancient homeland of humanity, that is probably a really good spot to have that concluding battle. You're taking them back to where it began. You have to obviously introduce that idea to the character, but show them like, hey, this was humanity's old home world. And this is where the Primordial was. And again, MacGuffins, Chekhov's gun, something that Mendicant mentioned, something about the Primordial and its position on Charum Hakor might be an area that they can then, interdict or defeat and cut the flood off for good. So now you have the Chief alone, and that's how I think it should be. The climatic battle, mano-a-mano, between him and whatever precursor primordial entity, and the threat is destroyed alongside with the flood. But if you're going to end the global threat, right, you're going to end that overarching arc, there's got to be some consequences. And that's why I think the Chief should die. I think he should win, but it's a win that ultimately takes his life. Because that final sacrifice, again, relating to the biblical, story of Christ, that idea that he is giving his life to wash away the original sin, the sin of the Forerunners turning on the creators, and allowing all this other life in the galaxy to go unjudged, if you will, by the Precursors. And now the Chief has ended that forever, allowing the universe, the galaxy, to more or less start anew. You can talk about humanity, the Covenant, really the Sangheli, and the other races able to bounce back and live their own life. And you can have a satisfying conclusion for Chief, again, biblical allegories here. Maybe after 3 days, homeboy wakes up in the domain. Cortana's there because, if you're going to be dead, might as well have your waifu. And maybe Johnson and Keyes and others that died to the flood or in conflicts are all there, and they realize hey, instead of the, authoritarian unity that the flood promised, now you have true unity in the neural physics left over by the Precursors in the domain. A unified, peaceful afterlife, not one that's, and you're getting consumed, because that would kind of be cap, right? But you could also have some flavor in there of the UNSC getting to Charum Hakor and they find Chief's armor. And there's no body inside because, again, biblical allegories is kind of cool, some flavor text there. And I think that's how you wrap it up. I know it sounds like a lot, but in my opinion, and this is just an opinion, feel free to tell me on ways you think it should be changed, but it provides a reasonable way to take the conflict from the OG games, fighting the Covenant over the rings, reestablishing that conflict that happened between the Forerunner and the Floods, some of the information in the books. You use that to drive a conflict over the mantle, something that 343 has clearly been trying to do in 4 and 5, just failing to do so. And now, 4 matters because 4 was the humbling of the Didact. 5 matters because it was, Cortana and Chief realizing in their 2 different ways that you cannot seize the mantle of responsibility through force. It is a burden you must carry. Cortana tried to take it and she ended up dying for it. And Chief understood properly that you don't look for leadership, leadership finds you. And he's simply continuing doing his duty as Chief, and that's where he took up the mantle when he defeats the Precursor entity, saving the galaxy. And obviously, climatic battle, so you do have to have galaxy-wide scale, threat there. But we know, okay, there's no more grave mines, there's no more flood, and for good. We cut off their ability to communicate, so even if FLUDD still exists, that's it. It just gives Microsoft and 343 a satisfyingly, way to end Chief's arc. And I think it's about time. Like I mentioned, Steve Downes is getting up there on age, probably can't make Chief stories forever. We can't just keep pumping out enemies for Chief to beat up. I think Halo should stick around and have spin-offs, as much as I think Steve Downes should, come back and do like voiceovers and other cameos. But I think it's time to provide, closure and conclusion to everyone who started becoming a fan back in like 2001 or whatever in Halo CE, that this conflict between humanity, different races, the FLUDD, the Forerunners, the Precursor, it all comes to one single end in a way that hopefully tries to tie together all the games so that people appreciate it more. People might rightfully think 4 and 5 are a booty, but now maybe you can see it holistically and be like, hey, it wasn't so bad. Well, that's it for this week. I know, full of spicy takes, kind of long right now, pushing probably like 30 minutes. But hey, I think it's about that time. I think we talk about ending the games. I'm not the only one. Actually, ironically, while I was writing the script, I've done a few takes because I'm always wordy. Installation 00 released his own video talking about how he thinks that Halo should end. And I agree. I think a lot of us that are fans, and probably you yourselves, are probably asking yourselves like, hey, when is 343 really going to give us a conclusion? Because it's not going to be satisfying if Chief just keeps on chiefing and then eventually Steve Downes is like, hey, I'm retiring. Either they recast him and it's terrible, or we just never know what happens. And I don't think that would be great. That'd be kind of a disservice. But either way, let me know how you feel in the comments. And you know what? Mad respect if you're still watching and listening, because it's been a long one. But I hope this was enjoyable. Take care, be safe, and hopefully you survive World War III. Peace.